Hello and welcome to my video. My name is Brian Salk. I am the owner of Pinnacle Professional Development, and I want to talk in this video about the PMP and CAPM courseware that will be used by New Horizons going forward, starting approximately June 2018. So in this video, I want to cover a few things and be as brief as I can. I want to talk about who should be listening to this video in the first place, although clearly PMP and CAPM is exciting for everyone in the world, but this video is a little bit more targeted. I'll tell you a bit about myself. What I consider to be very important is how did I lay out the materials for the PMP and the CAPM. Talk briefly about the instructor PowerPoint that's available to you. We'll also talk about the key system for students when they need to redeem resources. And if you have already redeemed your resources, then it works exactly the same for your participants. Then we'll talk briefly about each of the online resources that students have access to as they're studying, while they're in class, while they're studying, getting ready for the exams. And then support from myself should you need anything as you are delivering my material, as you're prepping my materials, etc. So that's what we want to talk about. So the audience for this video is, again, instructors who will be delivering the PMP and CAPM courseware. There's some slightly different pieces of information I'd like to share with operations managers and training managers. Some of that can be covered here, but I'll probably have separate correspondences for those folks so they understand their role and I understand my role with them as well. So that's the audience. Briefly, my background. For many of you, I've worked with you for over 20 years at this point, but some folks I have yet to meet. So briefly about my background, I've been in the business a little over 30 years and specializing in project management, education, instruction, and courseware development. So I do have 30-ish years of courseware development, mostly on the subject of project management, but early in my career, I did quite a bit of technical writing for custom software applications and some other subjects as well. I did spend 15 years with New Horizons of Michigan, and I've been delivering PMP for somewhere between 15 to 20 years. I was a contributing writer and/or a reviewer for 3 different versions of the PMBOK guide, the 3rd, 4th, and the current one, that's the 6th edition. And I earned my PhD in the education of project management, and I wrapped that up a couple of years ago. So that's my background. I want to talk about how I designed these materials for the PMP and the CAPM. Certainly I've been teaching this, as I mentioned, for quite some time, but as I was deciding how to put these materials together, I worked pretty extensively with a lot of my colleagues at New Horizons who design and develop their own courseware and their own exercises. And we had some really good conversations about how should the next version work. So what do they like about other courseware by other authors? I've created a lot of coursework for PMP over the years. What did they like about my previous versions? What did they not terribly care for in my previous versions? So it really was primarily based on my background delivering this material and a lot of feedback from New Horizons instructors and certainly from the multiple thousand folks going through the classes that I've met over the last bunch of years. So the courseware design is very, very intentional, and I hope that you like it. I hope you find it to be a very logical flow. So here's what I consider to be the heart of this presentation is how did I lay out these materials? So most books that are out there on PMP and CAPM, they follow the PMBOK, which is fine. And people understand that, and it does prepare them for the exam, and you go through chapter by chapter. But what I found over the years is many people are very confused on the layout of the knowledge areas, how you go from initiating through closing, and then you're right back in either initiating or planning. You go through monitoring and controlling, then you're back in planning. So perhaps the people that I've met over the years tend to be linear type learners. They organize their materials sequentially, and I think that's a very reasonable, common approach. So what I decided to do with this version is I decided to lay it out primarily by process group. So Briefly, the first 3 chapters of the PMP and CAPM material are the same 3 chapters from the PMBOK, so the introduction, the environment, the role of the project manager, but then I get into the knowledge areas. So we go through initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and closing. And I hope that makes sense to most people. It will be slightly disjointed when they try to find something in the PMBOK, although I have clearly called out what section of the PMBOK they'll find it. But here are a couple tweaks, and to my knowledge, no other courseware has done this, and I hope once I explain it and once you sort of get in the swing of prepping the material, it will make sense to you. The planning process group, I really thought about this long and hard, but here's how I've organized the planning process group. It's really 2 major sections. The first section is all of the management plans. So I know you teach PMP and CAPM, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But when you have something like a scope management plan, that's really describing the policies, process, procedures, roles, and responsibilities for everything else in this particular knowledge area. When you create the schedule management plan, that describes same stuff, policies, process, procedure, guideline for everything that's in the project schedule management row knowledge area. So what I do first in planning is I go through every management plan. We start with a project management plan. We talk about the scope and requirements management plan, schedule management plan, all the way down through the stakeholder engagement plan. Once we're done with all those management plans, and now we have an excellent view of how we're going to do all of the remaining planning through closing processes, we go back to the top and we fill in the blanks. So early in the chapter, we talk about scope and requirements management plan. Now we can actually collect requirements, create a scope statement, and a work breakdown structure for this project. Because we've already talked about the schedule management plan, we can then do all the remaining activities, processes to create an actual schedule. So again, that's really the flow of planning. It's very different than anything I've seen. I've had the chance to deliver this material 3 times. This is mid-May 2018. So I've had the chance to deliver 3 classes, and when I do set up the participants to say, this is the flow, it tends to get pretty favorable results. I sincerely hope you get the same success. Then when we get into executing, it's pretty linear as far as the material. I start with direct and managed project work all the way down through managed stakeholder engagement. Then we jump right back up, monitoring and controlling. So it's pretty linear. And because you teach this material, you know as well as I do, on a real project, it's not really a linear approach. Actually, it's quite the opposite sometimes. There is a lot of jumping around, but I think when people are prepping these courses, the flow, the way that I've set up the logic of the book, I hope that it helps them to get their heads around how the PMBOK guide works and how they can use that for a real world project. So anyway, that's how I have set up the material. And now I want to talk about each process. Of the 49 processes, here's the way that most of them I have structured them. First thing is not a surprise. I talk about what's the purpose of the process, what are the benefits, what are you kind of creating as part of this process, where's the value. But then here's something, again, that I do that's very different than any of the other books I've seen, and I hope you approve. But I, quote unquote, start with the end in mind. So when after I talk about the purpose of a particular process, I go right to the outputs. These are the things that will exist when this process is done. So it's a very concrete, tangible way to start every process. It really locks people into process X, Y, Z results in the creation of A, B, and C. And then we talk about those things, A, B, and C. What are they and what's their benefit, etc. And then once people have a solid foundation of the outputs of each and every process one at a time, then we can talk about the inputs and the tools and techniques that will lead to those outputs. So every book I've seen, inputs, tools, and techniques, and then outputs. And that's fine. That's the way the PMBOK is organized. But my students and the feedback that I've received over the years is start with the end in mind. And that's not my phrase, by the way. That's some other author. But I agree with it wholeheartedly. That's why I set it up. So again, start with the outputs, then you can talk about the inputs and tools and techniques that lead to that. And then for the vast majority of the processes, I have a slide that talks about once, process X is done, what are the processes that are downstream? What could come next? And the reason I do that is because, and I hope you agree, the strong rumor mill for the exams is you get a lot of questions of the project manager and the team have just done this. What should they do next? Now, that's not always a process question, but a lot of times it is. So the team has just created a requirements documentation or a traceability matrix. What should they do next? The team has just created a work breakdown structure. What should come next? So those are hard slides. They're really busy. If you've read over the 6th edition of the PMBOK guide, there's this huge listing of inputs and outputs. But again, I'm trying to help people get as ready for the exam as possible. So very briefly, let me show you the define scope. So here's the process define scope out of the slides. You're creating a scope statement. Here's what the purpose is. Here's what you'll find in the scope statement. Here's how scope statements typically work for plan-driven and agile projects. So this is what is a scope statement. What is the purpose of define scope? Now that we have the overview, what are the outputs of this process? Well, the answer is you have a scope statement and other stuff. And of course, all that is described in the speaker notes. Speaking of which, let me just sort of jump there. You do have your students and you have a full manual, and that's a very, very big change from the previous edition of my materials. But here's the slide, and then here's all the points that you can talk about for each and every one of these slides. So again, as an instructor with 30 years of experience, I'm hoping this makes your class very, very easy. You don't have to have one slide for 10 pages or 10 pages for 100 slides. It's a one-to-one mapping for the vast majority of the cases. So I hope you find value in that. Okay, so anyway, let's talk about the slides again. Give me a second. We'll go here. So here are the outputs. We have a project scope statement, and we have some other outputs. Those are the outputs of defined scope. To create these outputs, here are the inputs, and here are the tools and techniques. And then I do have that relationship to subsequent processes. Once you have a project scope statement, and you eventually lock it down, it becomes part of the project management plan. Once you have a scope statement, you can use that to decompose it to the work breakdown structure, and it's an input to this process as well, with all the description in the speaker notes of why it's a relationship to those processes. Speaking of relationships, something that has been, in my opinion, and many people's opinion, missing from the PMBOK guide for several generations is a end-to-end flowchart of all the processes. So back in the 2nd edition of the PMBOK guide, they actually had some pretty good graphics because it was a much simpler version. And so in planning, they had the, whatever it was, dozen and a half processes, and it was a really nice, simple flowchart. Well, the people who were writing the PMBOK guide felt that it's too complex. There are too many. This could lead to 100 other things, and so I think they got away from that. But I worked pretty extensively with another PMP colleague of mine to put a flowchart together, please catch this, that simplifies the relationship of processes. It absolutely does not capture every single process and how it leads to every single other process. And the reason we did that is because to have a full-blown graphic, although we could have done that, just would be unreadable. So it was our opinion that many questions on the exam can focus on, in the knowledge area, project risk management, project scope management, project whatever management. You've done this. What could come next? What should come next? And so we have created these flowcharts that really focus primarily on knowledge area relationships. So for risk, if you've planned risk management and you have the primary output of the risk management plan, that feeds all of the processes that come downstream in planning and executing and then eventually monitoring and controlling. Once you've identified the risks and you have your risk register and the risk report, that feeds your qualitative analysis. So what it says down at the very bottom, and this is my giant, very important disclaimer, very simple but very important disclaimer, is I can't quite scroll down far enough to show you. This document shows only primary outputs and some of the process relationships. Make sure you reference the PMBOK guide. And again, reference the slides, because that will tell you all of the inputs and all the tools and techniques in the outputs. But so far, in the 3 classes or so that I've delivered, people have responded this quite favorably. And maybe as you go through the processes, one at a time, you could keep this document open to help ground people on where they are. But you're the instructor, you can make all those decisions. All right, so jumping back, that's how I have set up the PMP and the CAPM books. I hope you like it. Let's move on. Let's talk about the instructor PowerPoint. Each and every one of you at this point in time should have a copy of the PMP and CAPM slides. Copyright, that is for you only for instructors, for redistribution to students, to other instructors that I haven't talked to is not permitted. So I hope you appreciate, as an author, I spent a year on creating all these materials. I just don't want it sent to the universe. So the PowerPoint is for instructors only. Students do have the full copy of the presentation, so it has all of the slides, plus all the speaker notes, but invariably students will just ask every single class, can you send me the slides? Can you send me the slides? So the tactful answer is, nah, copyright prohibits me from doing that, because otherwise I'd prefer not to have 1,000 other training companies using my materials. Anyway, that's it. Let's talk about the key system for student resources. So again, this is a copyright issue, and it's a contractual issue between my organization and New Horizons. I've provided, or will be providing, a massive listing of keys to your training manager, operations manager, regional manager. It's going to be given to somebody. And for each of the franchises, it might be somebody different. But as the instructor, you'll know who has the keys. And that person will give you a list of keys for your specific class. And then each student has to redeem a key on day 1 in the first hour. Besides, redeeming a key actually gives them their in-class resources. If they don't redeem their keys, they don't have anything. So please, it's very important, redeem keys with the students on day 1. Now, if you're there is no internet in our classes, okay, then you got to go to plan B, but hopefully you can foresee that and work around that. So some organizations, some instructors, what they'll do is they'll send out the keys a couple days beforehand, but that's, again, assuming that the roster is locked down. That's not always the case. All right, so let's just say you have a regular class with internet access. This is how you redeemed your keys as instructors, and this is the identical way that your students will do it as well. So they'll go to PinnacleProDev.com. That's going to take them here. Then they click on, even though they don't have an account, My Resources in the upper right-hand corner. And it'll go, well, if you have an account, you can log in. If you don't have an account, then click here. So by clicking here, it takes them to the registration page. So they'll work through this just like you did. The password always kind of blows people away. So people will try and and I know you're instructors and you set people up with keys, but people will try and have a password of their first name only. It's going to reject it. It's got to be a strong password. And then down towards the very bottom, here's the registration key. So each student is going to have a different key that you will assign to them. And once they register, that will give them access to their dashboard. It depends. They might have to log in a second time to get it, but then it'll open up the PMP 6th edition resources or the CAPM, just whichever class you're teaching. So let's see where we are in our slides. So we did that. Here's what some of the instructors who've been using my key system for half a decade or more, what they will do is they'll create a very simple table of here are the students and here are the keys, and then they'll just share this. And by sharing it, sometimes if you can, they'll put it in the chat window, someplace where people can copy and paste it. Over the years, my key system has existed for approximately 6-7 years. And my designer developer really made it pretty bulletproof. So I'm making up numbers. 80% of the people who say it doesn't work, they're just mistyping it. So the ability to copy and paste will make most of those errors go away. For the other folks that quote unquote it doesn't work, it's probably because they already have an account or their password's not strong enough, or some of the other really, really typical reasons. But the key, because it's something like a 10-character key, that's what causes most of the problems. So copy and paste is going to be your best friend. All right. What else? All right. So let's talk about the student resources. When the students redeem their key and it brings them to their dashboard, briefly, this will give them a PDF document that actually describes these other 4 icons and how they use them. But that's what I want to take you through right now as quickly as I can. But again, this PDF will actually say, well, here's how you use the exam simulator. Here's how you use the flashcards. Here's what they want the minute they have an account. They want to download those resources, and that will download them to their machine. They can extract them. They can copy and paste them anywhere they want. Let's talk about something. So that's very important. Next is, let's talk about definition flashcards. So there are about 500 flashcards, and they just work with terms and definitions. So here's a definition. What's the correct term? People think in their heads, well, I think the term is XYZ, and then they check their answer, and there's the right answer. On the other hand, this can also work as a multiple choice question. So what's the definition of a project schedule network diagram? Give me a hint. Make it a question. People go, oh, I think it's this one right here. And then it'll go, nope, here's the right answer right here. So the definition flashcards, again, the glossary flashcards, there are about 500 plus terms there. So that's how that works. So going back to the dashboard, the next thing I want to show you in record time is the ITO flashcards, Input Tool Technique Output flashcards. People have been asking for this tool for years and years, so I had it designed and developed. Well, actually, I designed it. My developer put it together. This is a very accurate tool that's not a very good tool. And the reason I say that is because, and I hope you agree, there are very few questions on the exam that will ask them which of the following is an input to process X, which of the following is an output of process Y. You get far more questions of what's the purpose, value, benefit, definition of input XYZ. So, or here's a scenario, the team is encountering this. Which of the following tool and technique is the best to help them resolve that situation? But here's the ITO flashcard in record time. You can focus on ITOs from a specific knowledge area or a process group like planning or executing. And people say, I think the answers are here. And it'll go, no, that's not right. Give me another question. It'll go, okay, what's a tool and technique of develop project management plan? Oh, I think it's this one, and I think it's that one. And then they'll say that, and yep, it is. Anyway, it'll also show all the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. Again, it works. I just don't think it's a very powerful tool. I would not use it for more than, I don't know, an hour getting ready for the exam. The best use of their time, in my strong opinion, is the exam simulator, and that's right here. So the exam simulator, what it does is it can give them a random bank of questions, choosing specific process groups, just like the exam, questions that focus on one or more specific knowledge areas, so they can pick that, or then the simulated PMP exam. So the simulated PMP exam, what it's going to do is it's going to pull from the same percentages as the real exam, and they can do 10 or 20 questions, or they can do 200 questions. It will time out on them if they decide to walk away for 2 hours, so it says that right here. So, consider 50-ish questions just in case the phone rings and they get really busy. Anyway, when they start working their way through this, well, this is the trial version, but you'll have access to the full version. It looks like the real test. So people will say, I think the answer is this, and then I think the answer is this. And eventually, and they can mark questions if they want to, and they'll see they can go back if they want to, just like the real exam. And when it does end, it will actually say, it'll give them a printout. I chose a very small section of questions, so it didn't give me too many areas. but it actually says for the knowledge areas, here's how you did. So pretend this says 13 out of 13. Then for integration, they're pretty darn good with those. Pretend for scope, it says 5 out of 10. Well, they need to study that more. Process group, same thing. Let's assume they got 6 out of 6 for executing and 5 out of 5 for monitoring and controlling, but 1 out of 5 for closing. They need to study that stuff more. Plus, it does give them a full review of every single question, every right answer, here's why it's the right answer, every wrong answer or not the best answer, here's why it's not the best answer. So this tool, again, has been refined over many years, and it should be pretty airtight, but I guess here's the big disclaimer. This was developed and tested with Chrome as well as Firefox. And the only people it tends not to work for, it's not a joke, I guess it is a joke, are people who have viruses on their machine. They get all kinds of crazy results. But the other thing is when people use things like Internet Explorer, there are a lot of different versions of Internet Explorer, and for some people it works flawlessly. Other folks, they get very strange results. So, they can try a newer version of Internet Explorer or Edge, but if they get crazy results, then just use Chrome, use Firefox. There are others. I just haven't spent a whole lot of time doing extensive testing, just because I know Chrome is so popular, Firefox is so popular, that between those two, people should be fine. And they can always just try Internet Explorer. It works great. It doesn't work great. They'll figure it out very quickly. Okay, so that, I think, is just about it. Last thing is support. If you are going through the materials, you're prepping the materials, you're teaching the materials, and you have questions for me, comments for me, or if you find corrections, if something just isn't right, my materials consist of approximately 650,000 words between all of the slides and all of the support files. So when it's whatever it is, 600, 700,000 words, not every one of them is going to be perfect. So if you find things that are not quite correct or confusing, send me an email. It always drives me crazy when I have to deliver a class with somebody else's material and I don't understand what's on page 1, or I think page number 2 is contradictory, and there's just nobody to talk to. You're on your own. So instead of skating around those issues, call me, send me an email. I have worked very closely with the New Horizons Michigan folks for years just because I work there. But I have established a good, solid network with instructors. You are my colleagues, and I want you to be really comfortable and satisfied with these materials. If you are comfortable with them, if they make sense to you, then that puts you in an excellent position to present it to your students. And when the day is done, everybody wins. So if there's something you just don't like, or you say it could be improved, send me an email. And I take those types of emails and phone calls very, very seriously. And together we can improve the courseware. So I hope you see this as a good partnership relationship. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, good luck delivering the courses, and I hope to hear from you soon.